Johnson's remarks about the correspondence theory are not to be despised, particularly in the 90-second Rambler. There's nothing in the art of versifying so much exposed to the power of imagination as the accommodation of the sound to the sense. It is scarcely to be doubted that on many occasions we make the music that we imagine ourselves to hear, that we modulate the poem by our own disposition, and ascribe to the numbers the effects of the sense. But on the other hand, the measure of time in pronouncing may be varied so as very strongly to represent not only the modes of external motion, but the quick or slow succession of ideas and consequently the passions of the mind. His examples certainly show very clearly that there is no single mode of correspondence, that very similar devices of sound may correspond effectively to very different meanings. And often enough in Milton, for instance, it is the opposite of onomatopoeia which is employed. Thus in the lines about Vulcan, thrown by angry Jove sheer o'er the crystal battlements, from morn to noon he fell, from noon to dewy eve, a summer's day, and with the setting sun dropped from the zenith. Milton is extremely cool about the matter. One is made to sit with him pleasantly in the shade all day long, needing no further satisfaction. It is delightfully soothing to feel that the devil is all the time falling faster and faster, but this is only to say that a sound effect must be interpreted. I think myself its most important mode of action is to connect two words by similarity of sound so that you are made to think of their possible connections. Another of Johnson's remarks brings up some questions which deserve mention. Dionysius himself tells us that the sound of Homer's verses sometimes exhibits the idea of corporeal bulk. Is not this a discovery nearly approaching to that of the blind man who, after long inquiry into the nature of the scarlet color, found that it represented nothing so much as the clangor of a trumpet? The blind man seems to have anticipated Miss Sitwell, who has actually used this comparison, I think very justly. She also writes, "The light is braying like an ass," which of course depends for its effect on the whole scene described. In such cases, apprehension in terms of one of the senses is described in terms of, or compared with, one of the others. This has been called synesthesia, and is clearly sometimes effective. It throws back the reader upon the differentiated affective states which are all that such sensations have in common. Perhaps recalls him to an infantile state before they had been distinguished from one another, and may actually induce a sort of rudimentary disorder into his modes of sensation, so that the images of the visualizer are transformed sounds. Like those due to migraine or epilepsy or drugs like mescal eaters have just that impression common among readers of pure poetry, that they are seeing very delightful but quite new colors, or knowing something which would be very important and interesting if they could make out just what it was. But how such a disturbance can be of serious importance to a reader of poetry, it is not easy to see, or how one is to be sure when it is occurring. Often it is no more than a device for insisting on ambiguities of the first type. The main comparison is neither true nor false, and one is thrown back on a series of possible associations as to the social setting in which these sensations would be expected, or the mood in which they would be sought out. Miss Sitwell seemed often to use the device rather as a flag of defiance, to insist that the main meaning is not what she valued, and the reader must put himself into a poetic or receptive frame of mind. These two things are alike in that, for quite different reasons, they harmonize with my mood. But in a way, this is only to push the notion of correspondence further back. How do these sensations come to seem proper to their social setting or their mood? Poe often seems excited about colors in a way that reminds one of people's reports from mescal. But then it is a Mexican drug, and he probably tried it. One cannot deduce anything very profound about poetry from that. And Swinburne often uses devices that seem to demand synesthesia. Thy voice is an odor that fades in a flame. and such like. But that is only part of his diffused use of grammar, by which several precise conceits can be dissolved into a vagueness. It would probably be a misreading here to confuse the modes of sensation, nor, so far as I can see, is his use of the device at all similar to that made of it by Miss Sitwell. Of course, when a poet is describing paintings, as Spencer does so often, the colors mentioned are supposed to act on one as they would do in a painting. Now, it is naturally harder to analyze the visual arts than poetry, because their modes of satisfaction are further removed from the verbal system on which the discursive intelligence usually supports itself. In any case, I am not competent to do such a thing and shall not attempt it here. I mention this mysterious matter as a way in which poetry might be taking effect, but which I shall assume I can ignore. And it seems worth uttering the pious hope that such effects do not really depend on an obscure physiological perversion which could be exploited separately so as to deceive, but that there is a field for analysis in the way the paintings admired by a particular school of poets are assumed as elements of sensibility and referred to covertly in their poetry. So the discovery of the blind man may have its importance, but we must now turn to what Dionysius himself said, which may be very important indeed. I mentioned a moment ago the theory that language is fundamentally a system of gestures with the tongue. There is no doubt that once the advocate of pure sound has admitted that sound has some connection with meaning, Sir Richard Paget's method of interpretation gives him a great deal of rational support. Everyone feels that quite apart from words, like pop, which are like their meaning, there are words like we, which are fitted to their meaning. The Paget theory would explain this, taking only the vowel for this brief example, by saying that while huge moves the tongue back from the teeth so as to make as large a space as it can, we moves the tongue as near to the teeth so as to leave as small a space as it can. In this way, not the sound itself, but our experience of the way it is produced does in fact continually exhibit the idea of corporeal bulk, which is just what Johnson thought was impossible. All the sounds may be reduced to gestures in this way, more or less fancifully. They all then carry some suggestion of size or shape or movement or pressure up, down, forward, or backward, and in themselves that is all they can convey. This theory would have a peculiar charm for the materialists who wanted to explain everything in terms of Euclid and Newton. It offers a sort of guarantee that the explanation will be a picture on the blackboard. It is rather bad luck that it should be developed so late, when the faith of even of physicists in pictures on the blackboard is not what it was. But that it explains some part of the effect of language, it would be hard to deny. Evidently, there is another field for the future analysis of poetry, when it becomes possible to list the root notions that the words must by their own nature be suggesting. It will be possible and profitable to discuss in some detail how far their sound is an echo to their sense, but such a process will always be subject to curious limitations. Owing to the comparative paucity of different mouth gestures, each mouth gesture, which produces its own particular sound or root word, has to stand for a considerable number of hand or other bodily gestures. To put it another way, each root word is naturally liable to bear many different meanings. One other point may be noted. The same mouth gesture may be naturally construed in several different ways. Thus, the movement of tongue or lips may represent a pantomimic movement symbolizing a real movement or a spatial relation of some kind, e.g., above, below, around, or it may represent a shape of some kind drawn in outline. Finally, any of these meanings may be used figuratively instead of concretely. Sir Richard Paget, Human Speech. Apart then from the ambiguities in the fully developed language, such as I propose to consider, one would also have to consider the ambiguities of the same sort, but entirely different in their details, which are always latent in the fundamental symbolism of the sound. This suggests that the process of analyzing the effect of a poem, not indeed completely, but sufficiently to be any use, must be one of altogether impossible complexity, that one must instead give up all hope of doing such a thing and fall back on doctrinaire irrationalism. It is true that no explanation can be adequate, but on the other hand, any one valid reason that can be found is worth giving. The more one understands one's own reactions, the less one is at their mercy. Thus it seems to be fairly true, as a matter of introspection,